I basted the turkey myself. Woke up at 5 a.m., peeled 10 pounds of potatoes, and hand-folded the name cards just like Mom used to when Grandma was still around. I even stitched fresh holly into the table runners. No one asked me to. I just wanted to feel like I belonged again. By 4 p.m., everything was glowing. The tree, the candles, the smiles. Even Mom told me, "You outdid yourself, honey." Then dinner was called. Everyone moved to the dining room, their names laid out in gold cursive across porcelain plates. I waited near the kitchen, expecting someone, anyone, to say, "Come sit." But instead, my mother glanced over her shoulder and said, sweetly but firmly, "You can eat in the pantry, dear. We ran out of chairs." My brother chuckled, loud enough for the rest of them to catch on. "Why would she need a spot at the main table?" He smirked. Not one person said a word. Not my sister, not my aunt, not even Dad. So I carried my plate to the pantry, past the mop bucket, past the broken toaster, past every damn time I'd swallowed my feelings just to keep the peace. I sat alone, next to a stack of cleaning rags, and listened to them laugh over the apple pie I baked. That was the moment I realized I wasn't forgotten. I was removed. And I swore, next Christmas, they'd remember me, whether they wanted to or not. My name is Lauren. I was the one they always said was too sensitive. But this isn't about sensitivity. It's about dignity. Before I share what happened after that night, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a hi in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been pushed aside by the people you bent over backward to help, consider subscribing. I'm telling this not to hurt anyone, but to finally tell the truth. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. The Pennsylvania countryside lay quiet beneath a dusting of snow, the bare trees casting long shadows in the soft gray light. Evelyn Monroe's tires crunched over the frozen gravel as she turned into the long driveway of her family's farmhouse. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. In the passenger seat sat a square thermal box, sealed with care and a ribbon of red gingham. Inside, her grandmother's old English figgy pudding, steeped in cloves and dark rum, steamed the night before with the same pot her father once gifted her when she first opened her restaurant in Chicago. She had thought long and hard about whether to come back this year, but the voice in her head wouldn't let go. I don't want forgiveness, I want acknowledgement. The house looked just like it always had, immaculate, rigid, symmetrical, too perfect. Marlene Monroe, her mother, opened the door with a smile as polished as the antique brass doorknob she clutched. "Well," she said, eyeing Evelyn's coat, "looks like you've gained some city weight. Come on in." No embrace, no warmth in her voice, just civility, barely. Evelyn smiled, nodded, and stepped inside. The scent of cinnamon and roasted ham filled the air, mingling with fresh pine from a massive wreath that hung over the mantel. Inside the living room, cousins and uncles chatted around wine glasses, laughter flitting above the classical music humming from hidden speakers. Evelyn's eyes locked with her brother's from across the room. Clayton Monroe stood near the fireplace, tall and composed in his navy blazer, swirling a glass of Cabernet like he owned the oxygen in the room. He raised his glass to her, casually, coldly. She offered a small nod. "City didn't kill you. That's good," he said as she passed by. His words hung there, deliberately stripped of sincerity. Evelyn made her way into the kitchen, the pudding still in her arms. She held it out to her mother. "From Grandma's kitchen, with memory," she said, offering a quiet smile. Marlene took it without looking at it. "Lovely. I'll put it somewhere. You can help Rachel with the deviled eggs, yes?" It wasn't a question. Evelyn pressed her lips together and turned toward the counter, where a younger cousin had already neatly piped yolk filling into perfect ovals. The pudding disappeared behind a cabinet door. Later, as the table was being set, Evelyn noticed something off. 10 place settings, china and crystal laid with military precision, 12 guests. "I think there's a card missing," she said gently, scanning the table. "Where should I?" Marlene turned with that same rehearsed smile. "Oh, sweetheart, I thought you could eat in the pantry. It's cozy, quiet, just like your little restaurant, right?" The pantry. The same cramped little room off the kitchen where the canned goods lived, where Evelyn had once been sent as a child for talking back. Her throat tightened. Before she could find her words, Clayton chimed in from the fireplace. "Why would we mess up the flow for her?" He grinned. People laughed. A few awkward, a few complicit. Evelyn chuckled lightly even as her stomach turned. She carried her plate to the pantry, step by step, past the butcher block, past the chair she had once perched on at 12 years old after her mother called her disrespectful for defending her father in a dinner argument. The pantry was cold, cramped, stale. A single folding chair sat next to a shelf of preserves and paper towels. She placed her plate down, closed the door behind her. She didn't cry. Instead, her eyes found the old wooden plaque still hanging above the dry goods shelf. Her father had carved it years ago, long before the cancer, long before the silence between them all grew thicker than blood. Legacy is what we pass with hands, not mouths. Evelyn stared at it for a long while, then whispered to herself, "Not this time." And she sat, back straight, fork in hand. Not as their afterthought, but as their mirror. She would not run, she would not rage, she would stay, but not as they expected. The pantry was quiet, save for the soft hum of conversation bleeding through the closed door. Evelyn sat on the edge of the folding chair, her plate balanced on her lap, half filled with cold salad and untouched ham. The overhead light flickered once, then settled into a dim yellow glow, casting a nostalgic tint on the canned beans and spice jars lining the shelves. Her fork hovered over a slice of deviled egg, but she wasn't hungry. She was somewhere else. In her mind, it was the summer of 2002. The orchard had been bursting with bees and blooms, the heat heavy but fragrant with clover. She'd flown in that year just for a weekend, one of the rare visits before distance and silence took over. Her father, Sam Monroe, had insisted they take a walk through the east lot, the less manicured side of the property where the trees still grew wild and stubborn. Roots twisted around stones older than the farmhouse itself. They'd paused by a young apple tree, its blossoms like pale fireworks against the blue sky. Sam placed a rough hand on her shoulder and said, almost like a confession, "This land's slow, but it knows who loves it. One day, this side's yours." She'd laughed then, not believing him. But he turned and looked at her. Really looked. "The east lot," he repeated. "It's for the one who listens, not the one who shouts." Now, sitting among shelves of forgotten Tupperware and faded spice labels, Evelyn gripped the edges of her plate, feeling the weight of his voice again. The echo of that promise had never faded, even when everything else had. Her father died in 2016, a heart attack in his sleep. Evelyn had rushed back for the funeral, clutching the eulogy and shaking hands, her face blank under the scrutiny of relatives she barely remembered. That was the last time she walked into the house as someone with a place at the table. Weeks later, she was called into the study with her mother and Clayton. She remembered the leather armchair her father used to sit in, now occupied by Clayton like a king crowned in grief. "There's nothing in writing, honey," her mother had said, her tone laced with feigned sympathy. "It's better we split things by logic." Logic, a word they weaponized against her. Despite her father's words, the east lot was absorbed into the greater estate, parceled under Clayton's name. Evelyn was given a few heirlooms and a polite thank you. Not a square foot of land, not even the plot under the tree. She didn't argue, didn't protest, not out loud. But deep down, something twisted, then settled into place, like roots bracing for winter. What they didn't know was that Evelyn hadn't left completely empty-handed. Tucked into the lining of her worn leather suitcase, hidden beneath the fabric, she kept a small cream-colored envelope. The return address read, George L. Farnsworth, attorney at law. It had arrived exactly 40 days after the funeral, just as her grief had started to harden into quiet resolve. She'd opened it on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in her Chicago apartment, hands trembling, heart unsure what to hope for. Inside was a letter, written in her father's careful cursive. Evie, I know I never got to say this at the table, but you've always been the root. The East Orchard is yours. Ask George if you ever need proof. Love you more than I ever said, Dad. She'd folded the letter back into its envelope, slipped it into a book on her nightstand, and never told a soul. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a deed. But it was something stronger. A truth she carried like a compass when everything else blurred. A private inheritance, etched in ink and memory. Back in the pantry, Evelyn reached into her coat pocket. The pudding tin had cooled now, its warmth fading just like the warmth in this house. She pressed her fingers gently against the lid. Her eyes didn't well with tears. She'd cried years ago, alone in an airport bathroom. Now there was only clarity. I waited for someone else to see what he saw in me, she whispered. But maybe it's time I see it myself. The pantry no longer felt like exile. It felt like a threshold. She folded her napkin, set her untouched plate aside, and leaned back, eyes on the wooden plaque still hanging over the doorframe. Her father's words echoed again. Legacy is what we pass with hands, not mouths. And for the first time in years, Evelyn smiled, not out of performance, but recognition. She was no longer looking for permission. She already had his blessing. The farmhouse was steeped in soft candlelight, its windows glowing gold against the dark sweep of Christmas Eve. The smell of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and burnt sugar from overglazed carrots hung heavy in the halls. Laughter echoed down the corridor, the kind that was just a bit too polished, like everything else in the Monroe household. And in the den, beside a pile of perfectly wrapped presents, Evelyn was crafting a gift of her own. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers steady as she folded thick crimson tissue paper over a manila envelope. Her movements were deliberate, quiet, surgical. No ribbons, no bows, just a single tag, handwritten in ink that didn't shake, to the one who takes more than he gives. Inside the envelope were 3 things. First, a high-resolution scan of her father's handwritten letter, the one he never said aloud, never entered into formal record, but wrote with a clarity Evelyn had clung to for 7 years. It was her compass, her map, her key. Second, a series of tax records from 2011 to 2016, clearly indicating that Sam Monroe had filed and paid taxes separately for the East Orchard. 5 years of paper trails proving intent and action, not just sentiment. And finally, a quiet bombshell, a copy of a loan application Clayton had filed in 2017 with a local bank, using the East Orchard as part of his stated assets. Bold, reckless, and most importantly, fraudulent, since he had no documented right to include that land. The signature was unmistakable, Clayton P. Monroe. Evelyn didn't smile as she tucked the envelope into a plain square box and sealed it shut. Her heart didn't race. There was no joy in revenge, no thrill in revealing. There was only precision and inevitability. That night, While others bustled in the kitchen carving ham and polishing glasses, she moved like a shadow through the dining room. Marlene was orchestrating seating placements with the efficiency of a battlefield general, unaware that her empire's center of gravity had already begun to tilt. Evelyn approached the long oak table, the same one her father had built by hand decades ago. 12 chairs surrounded it, an even dozen this time. No pantry exile tonight. But Evelyn wasn't interested in her seat. Her eyes were on the one at the head of the table, Clayton's chair. The one he always claimed first, as if inheritance were a birthright measured in posture. Bending down, Evelyn slid the box beneath it. Wrapped in stillness, it fit perfectly against the leg of the chair, hidden from sight but too large to miss once someone sat down. She stood back and took one last glance. The table was stunning. Silver cutlery, sprigs of rosemary at each napkin fold, wine glasses tall and expectant. It could have graced a magazine cover, but it was hollow, staged. Every part of it a performance. Evelyn turned and walked back into the hall, brushing past garland and laughter. From the far end of the room, she heard someone call her name, but she didn't stop. In the quiet of the guest room, she sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled. Let them unwrap truth, she thought, even if it burns their perfect holiday. Dinner began not long after. Toasts were made, plates were passed. And finally, just as the first bite of pecan pie met polished forks, Clayton pushed back his chair slightly, reaching down to adjust a shoe, and his fingers grazed the edge of the box. He lifted it up, turning it over with mild confusion. Everyone's attention flicked toward him, curious. "What's this?" he asked lightly. But Evelyn didn't answer. She sat across the table, hands folded calmly in her lap. No smugness, no show. Just a slow, subtle nod, like someone signaling the end of a chapter only she had finished reading. Marlene leaned in to peek. The tag caught her eye. To the one who takes more than he gives. Clayton's brow furrowed. He tore open the paper, revealing the envelope. The room grew still, the clink of cutlery fading into silence. He slid out the papers, flipping through the pages. His face changed. Barely at first, but enough for Evelyn to notice. A flicker of recognition. A tightening of the jaw. And then a flush of heat that rose from his neck into his ears. No one spoke. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the table. Evelyn held her gaze steady. She had waited 7 years for this moment, and not because she wanted to humiliate him, but because truth, like soil, needed air to breathe. To become something more than memory, he could either crumble or confront. That choice was his. But the orchard had always been hers. For a brief, flickering moment, everything looked normal. The ham was perfectly sliced. The cranberry sauce shimmered in a porcelain bowl. Wine flowed into crystal glasses as laughter curled through the room like warm smoke. Evelyn could almost pretend, that the tension at the edges was just holiday nerves. Until Clayton pulled the box from beneath his chair. He tilted it in his hands, confused. The tag caught his eye first. His brow furrowed, lips curling in an amused smirk. To the one who takes more than he gives, he read aloud, voice tinged with sarcasm. Well, that's festive. Everyone turned. Conversations halted. Silverware hovered midair. Clayton peeled the wrapping slowly, theatrically. He opened the box, pulled out the envelope, and unfolded the contents with the same smug detachment he'd always worn, like a man certain the universe was built to serve him. Then his expression changed. First confusion, then something deeper, darker. His eyes scanned the letter from their father, the original, not a copy, and then the tax records, and finally, the loan agreement. He blinked once, twice as if trying to erase what he saw. A yellow post-it note fluttered onto his lap, written in Evelyn's slanted hand, "Happy holidays, from the forgotten branch of this tree." For a second, the only sound was the faint pop of the fire behind them. Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't need to. Clayton laughed, but it was thin, brittle. "Cute," he muttered. "What is this? A little performance? Some Christmas dramatics?" Evelyn's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Just facts, and a reminder that inheritance isn't a matter of volume." Her eyes flicked toward him, steady and unblinking. "You can shout all you want, Clayton," but Dad chose quietly. Marlene leaned forward, her face frozen somewhere between embarrassment and rage. "Evie," she said through gritted teeth, "is this really necessary? You've had your moment." But before Evelyn could answer, someone else did. A voice from the far end of the table, raspy, firm. "I remember this," said Aunt Ruth, her fork now resting untouched beside her plate. She was Sam's younger sister, always seated near the edge of the action, rarely speaking, but her voice now cut through the silence like a bell. "Sam said it years ago, one Thanksgiving. We were out by the porch swing, sipping cider. He looked out at the east orchard and said, 'That's Evie's, the one who listens, not the one who shouts.'" All eyes turned to her. Evelyn didn't move. Her breath was steady, her back straight. Clayton's face flushed. He shook his head. "This isn't legal. It's not in the will. This is paper. Sentiment. Nothing binding." Evelyn reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a white business card, setting it down beside her wine glass. Her fingers didn't tremble. "George Finnegan," she said. "Dad's old lawyer. He's now mine." Clayton stared at the card like it might bite him. Marlene's voice cracked the air. "So you came here not to reconcile, but to corner us?" Evelyn finally looked directly at her mother. Her voice was still soft, but there was iron beneath it. "I came to sit at the table. You gave me a pantry. I brought my own seat." That line didn't echo. It landed. No one moved. No one dared fill the silence. Because beneath the twinkling lights, the heirloom china, and the polished silver, a fault line had opened, splitting years of repression, manipulation, and performance right down the center. Aunt Ruth whispered a quiet, "Good girl," but Evelyn didn't acknowledge it. She wasn't doing this for applause. She took a sip of wine, her eyes never leaving Clayton's. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth was loud enough. The tension in the room wasn't loud. It was clinical. Crisp and sterile like the air in a hospital corridor, just before bad news is delivered. Plates of untouched pie sat sweating on fine china, and the flickering candles only served to cast harsher shadows across flushed cheeks and tightened jaws. Marlene, ever the master of damage control, reached for her wine glass as if it were a baton of civility. Her voice, practiced and light, attempted to soothe the room like a mother smoothing a wrinkled tablecloth. "Let's not ruin dinner. We're still family," she said, eyes darting between her guests, offering up a fragile smile like a peace treaty no one had asked for. Evelyn didn't blink. "Family isn't ruined by truth," she said softly. "It's revealed by it." That landed hard. Even the chandelier seemed to pause. Clayton slammed his palm on the table, the silverware rattling. "That land's useless if you just sit on it," he barked. "I could have turned it into something. We had investors lined up." There it was, the slip. The real story under the curated smiles and seasonal cheer. Evelyn raised a brow. "Investors who think you own what you don't." He opened his mouth again, but Evelyn was already reaching into her satchel. She pulled out another envelope, thinner than the first, and slid it across the table. It stopped just short of Clayton's plate, next to a half-eaten roll he hadn't touched since the unveiling. Inside, a copy of the 2017 loan application. Highlighted in yellow was a section labeled Asset Supporting Collateral. Beneath it, in bold print, East Orchard, Monroe Estate. A quiet gasp came from Marlene. She turned to her son, her carefully applied lip color pale against the sudden drain in her face. "You told me you had her signature," she said, voice shaking. "You told me it was authorized." Clayton didn't answer. Evelyn's tone was cold now. "You forged my name?" she asked. "That's federal, Clayton." He didn't deny it, just clenched his jaw and stared down at the damning paper in front of him. Then Evelyn's eyes slid to her mother, and her voice softened. "And what about 2016? Marlene stiffened. "What do you mean?" "The amendment to Dad's land title," Evelyn continued. "Who signed it?" There was a flicker of something, a hesitation, a cornered animal flash of guilt, and then a whisper. "He wasn't well. It was for the family. I signed for him." Silence, thicker than any snow falling outside, deeper than the shame pooling in the corners of the room. Evelyn stood up. The legs of her chair didn't screech. They lifted clean from the floor, as if the house itself couldn't hold her weight anymore. She glanced around the table, her brother hunched and sweating, her mother suddenly small, Aunt Ruth biting her knuckle in disbelief. Everyone else frozen in tableau, unsure if they were witnesses or accomplices. Evelyn didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply said, "Then this family was built on a forgery." Her words didn't echo, they pierced. She turned to leave. No one stopped her. And just as she reached the threshold of the dining room, the same one she had once walked through as a child, desperate for approval, she turned back, eyes clear. "You always said silence makes us civilized," she said to the room. "I think silence just makes us accomplices." Then she walked out. Not a retreat, not an escape, a reclamation. The snow had melted by the time Evelyn returned to her townhouse in Lancaster, but the frost hadn't left her bones. She'd walked out of that farmhouse knowing she'd never be invited back. Not really, and she had made peace with it. But peace didn't last long. A week later, nestled among utility bills and a Christmas card from a publisher she hadn't spoken to in years, was a pale blue envelope bearing her mother's handwriting. The loops were perfect, as always. Marlene Monroe didn't make spelling errors or emotional messes. Inside, a letter soaked in the scent of lavender and revisionist history. "Let's start again. We can rebuild Monroe Farms together. Clayton and I have been speaking with a community investment group. They want to restore the orchard and make it green certified. A new chapter. With you. The way it should have been." Evelyn's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Attached was a letter from a firm called Sustainable Pennsylvania Collective and a proposal titled Community-Led Land Trust Development for Intergenerational Equity. It sounded noble, it sounded neutral, but Evelyn had cooked long enough to know when something stank underneath all the garnish. The next day, she agreed to meet Clayton at the Green Spoon, a cafe that served beet lattes and quinoa muffins like they were currency. She wore no makeup, her hair tied back, and brought nothing but a canvas folder and George's business card tucked into her coat. Clayton looked uncomfortable in flannel, like a fox in sheep's clothing. He stood too quickly when she arrived. "I overreacted," he began, his voice rehearsed, eyes trained on the coffee foam. "You deserve more. You always did. Let's do something together finally." Evelyn nodded, saying nothing. Clayton reached into his bag and pulled out a thick packet, clipped and tabbed in blue and yellow. "It's pretty straightforward," he said, tapping the first page. "You'll retain 40% ownership, but we'll need to transfer the deed temporarily, just to streamline the approval process." 40%! Evelyn repeated. You'd be the face of it, Evie, the legacy. And honestly, people love a comeback story. We could even name the new line after you. Evelyn's Orchard. She smiled softly. Leave it with me, she said. I'll have George look it over. That night, Evelyn brewed herself a cup of cinnamon tea, sat under her reading lamp, and went through every inch of the contract like a surgeon searching for tumors. And there it was, in fine print, Appendix 3.1c. In the event the project is delayed beyond 180 days, ownership of all land assets contributed by parties with less than majority control shall default to the acting development manager for project continuity. Translation: if anything stalled, even by design, Clayton would own the East Orchard outright. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. Instead, she scanned every page, every footnote, and every appendage. She printed 3 copies. One was mailed to George. The second was sealed in a manila envelope with a handwritten label. To be opened only in case of dispute. Property Records Office, Lancaster County. And the third she tucked away under a loose floorboard in her kitchen, where she used to store spices she didn't want anyone else using. The next morning, she emailed Clayton. Give me a few days, I just want to make sure this new seat at the table isn't made of sawdust. Later, as she folded laundry and set her sourdough to rise, Evelyn whispered to herself, so they didn't just forget me at the table, they planned a second seating without me entirely. She wasn't angry anymore. She was exact. And this time, she wouldn't be signing anything but their undoing. The wind rolled across the orchard like an old voice returning home. Evelyn stood at the edge of the east lot in a wool coat, boots caked with soil, and her father's letter folded once in her back pocket. This land had never been about money. It had been about memory, about roots, and now, about justice. Inside the Heritage Preservation Office, she signed the final document, her signature crisp and deliberate. Effective immediately, the East Lot would be transferred to the local Land Conservation Trust. Non-commercial, non-negotiable, protected forever. She clicked send on an email addressed simply to Clayton Monroe. Subject, signed. Body, I've signed. Not your contract. Mine. The phone call came less than 10 minutes later. You think this is funny? Clayton's voice cracked through the speaker. You just blew up a $300,000 loan. Do you know what you've done? I protected what wasn't yours to begin with. You're a bitter child in a grown woman's skin, he hissed. No, Evelyn said calmly. I'm a grown woman who finally stopped playing child to your drama. Word traveled fast in towns like theirs. Within 48 hours, Clayton's investors dropped him. The bank rescinded the loan. And then came the paperwork from the state tax office. Marlene Monroe received a formal inquiry regarding amendments filed in 2016 related to property ownership changes, papers she had signed in her husband's name. Evelyn's lawyer had forwarded a notarized request for review and an affidavit referencing document forgery. Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't post. She simply wrote a second email, this time to the town council, requesting to speak during the next public session. 2 weeks later, in a clean gray sweater and jeans still dusted with orchard dirt, Evelyn stood at the podium where her father had once spoken about land use and sustainable farming. The room was half full, neighbors, old friends, the local paper. She cleared her throat and began. I was told I didn't belong at the table, so I planted one under the old tree, where my father once promised me roots. No slideshow, no drama, just a truth returned to its rightful place. When she walked out, her shoes left prints on the marble floor. This time, no one asked her to leave by the pantry. Spring came early to the orchard that year. Evelyn strung warm lights between the apple trees her father had once grafted by hand. She borrowed folding tables from the community center, used crates for chairs, and hand-wrote name cards, but only for the kids. Adults were invited to sit wherever they liked. No rank, no assigned seating. She called it the East Table Gathering. Local families came, bringing pies and casseroles. The land trust sent a few volunteers. Old neighbors, the preservation board, even Ruth, the aunt who remembered what Sam had said that long ago Thanksgiving. At the entrance to the orchard, Evelyn had placed a hand-painted wooden sign. "Everyone's got a seat, no one eats in the pantry." By late afternoon, music played softly from a weathered radio. Children ran between tree rows. Guests passed dishes down the table. Evelyn moved among them calmly, her hands full, but her heart light. Near sunset, a figure approached from the gravel road, wrinkled suit, slumped shoulders. Clayton. He waited until most guests had left. Evelyn was folding cloth napkins when he stepped up behind her. "You made your point," he said, voice ragged. "But this isn't what Dad would have wanted." She kept folding. Didn't speak. "We could fix it," he tried again. "Sell the orchard, split the gain, start a new legacy." Evelyn turned, looked him in the eye. "I already did, and it doesn't have your name on it." Clayton's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed he might say something cruel, but all he managed was, "You always did play martyr better than the rest of us." "I'm not a martyr," she replied. "I just stopped being an accessory." He hesitated, looked down. "So that's it?" Evelyn nodded. "You took my place at the table, so I built a better one. Now you're welcome, if you come with empty hands." She left him standing there, among the folding chairs and dappled light, while she carried the last of the dishes inside. As twilight fell, Evelyn returned to the orchard one last time, setting a long wooden table beneath the flowering trees. There were no placards, no hierarchy, just one small chalkboard in the center that read, "Sit, share, begin again." No one was forgotten. No one was banished. This wasn't a holiday. It was a homecoming, on her terms. The envelope was old and brittle, tucked among crumbling files in a wooden crate marked Sam Monroe, Personal. Evelyn ran her fingers over the splintered edge of the crate as George, her father's old lawyer, watched her silently from across his office. "I found this cleaning out the archives," George said softly. "It should have come to you years ago." Inside were two documents, a draft of a will never signed, and a letter, creased, blotched, but legible. The beginning hit her like a breath pulled in too fast. "Evie left us. Maybe that's her choice. Maybe she doesn't belong here anymore." It stung. It was honest. It was her father's doubt. But then, on the back of the page, scrawled hastily in a different pen, almost as an afterthought, "But blood isn't loyalty, and silence isn't peace. If she finds her way back, this orchard is hers, entirely." Her eyes didn't fill with tears. Not this time. She simply nodded, her jaw locked. "That explains the panic," she said. "They didn't just forget. They deleted." George hesitated, then added. Clayton read it. "Years ago, your mother asked him to represent the family. He saw that line, never brought it up again." Evelyn didn't speak. Her silence this time wasn't surrender, it was clarity. At the bottom of the crate, she found something else. A photo. Her father, sleeves rolled up, mid-build on a wooden bench, unfinished. The same piece of aged applewood Evelyn had salvaged to make her table. She hadn't realized what it was. Now she knew. That weekend, she sanded the wood again, this time not for a table, but to complete the bench her father never finished. On Sunday morning, she hosted a quiet tea gathering in the East Orchard. Just her, Marlene, Clayton. No reporters, no lawyers, no guests. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse, just placed 3 items on the table: the letter, the photo, and the newly completed bench. Then she said, "I won't sue. I won't forgive. I will remember. And I want you to do the same." She walked away, leaving them in the orchard where so much had been buried, and where, finally, something honest had been unearthed. The bench sat beneath the oldest tree, its wood smoothed by Evelyn's hands. It held no plaque, just the weight of truth. By late September, the East Orchard hummed with new life. Kids laughed as they darted between the trees, their hands sticky with juice and wonder. The first apples of the season, crimson and imperfect, hung low on branches that had once been weighed down by silence. Evelyn stood beside a newly painted sign: "The Orchard Fellowship. Plant. Share. Grow. ... What began as a boundary line in an old man's will had become a starting point for something no one could take. The nonprofit she founded hosted weekend workshops for local kids, planting heritage apple trees, learning old farm tales, even crafting journals out of orchard leaves. One small corner had a stone marker that read, "In memory of Sam Monroe, a man who loved the land and the silence he mistook for peace." Clayton left town quietly, sold what was left of his land to cover debts. No farewell, no scene, just a moving van and a for sale sign that stayed up longer than expected. Marlene remained in the house, her presence shrinking as the community stopped inviting her to potlucks or asking for her opinion at town hall. She wasn't exiled, she was simply forgotten. A mirror of what she'd once made Evelyn feel. Evelyn never blocked their calls. She didn't have to. They no longer had anything to ask for. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Evelyn sat cross-legged on the grass, surrounded by second graders from the local school. Their field trip had taken them to the East Orchard, where they now picked apples and scribbled in notebooks. A small girl raised her hand. "Who planted the first tree here?" Evelyn smiled. Her hands touched the earth near the roots. "A man who thought silence meant peace," she said, "and a girl who thought being quiet meant belonging." She didn't need to explain the rest. The orchard said it for her. As the sun dipped lower, golden light filtered through the branches. Evelyn stood, brushed dirt from her jeans, and walked the rows slowly, the same rows her father once walked. Wooden benches lined the paths now, each one carved by local hands, none bearing names. Just one final sign, etched in hand-carved letters. "Sit wherever you like, there's always room." No hierarchy, no pantry seats. The orchard had become what it was always meant to be, not an inheritance of land, but of space, of story, of truth, shared under open sky. And Evelyn? She had not just found her place, she built it, and made sure there was room for anyone who came in peace. Sometimes, the people who shut the door on you are the ones who taught you how to build your own. And sometimes, peace isn't found by being quiet, it's found by choosing yourself, even when no one else does. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please like, subscribe, and stay with me. There's always more to tell.